Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of our HipFest at Home presentations for 2026. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alison Strauss, and I am the director of HipFest and the programmer of the Hippodrome year-round. We're just going to start off with a bit of housekeeping, as per usual, before we get properly underway. Subtitles are available by clicking the CC or closed caption icon in the YouTube video player. And if you're joining this presentation for the online premiere, you can submit questions or comments in the chat box. To do this, you just need to log into YouTube. It's a fairly straightforward sign up, and then you'll be able to chat away in our premieres each year. Our speaker, Bruce, has kindly agreed to watch along as this talk goes live, so he'll endeavour to respond to any messages in the chat throughout the presentation. And just bear in mind that the window will close quite quickly once the premiere has concluded, so don't save all your questions and comments for the end. Try to drop them in as we go. So, I'm feeling particularly buzzy today because at the time of recording this, we have just launched the full programme for our 16th edition of HipFest. And as I'm sure you know, our annual HipFest activity is concentrated over 5 days in March. But we have tons of extra activities beyond those dates, each one designed to enhance every aspect of your silent film fix, including this very presentation, which kicks off our celebration of the Art Deco movement born in the silent era. We are very grateful to the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, whose grant funding has supported a host of Art Deco-themed programming at HipFest 2026, including a free exhibition at the Bowness Library called Art Deco Scotland, Design and Architecture in the Jazz Age, on display from the 21st of February to the 25th of April, a free guided walking tour tracing the influence of Art Deco architecture on the streets of Bowness, and that takes place on Sunday the 22nd of March at noon, and you can sign up via Eventbrite just to let us know you're coming. A rare screening as well of the very pinnacle of Art Deco style in British cinema, Maurice Elvey's High Treason, with live piano accompaniment by Mike Nolan. And the screening is on Friday the 20th of March, and tickets are on sale now. And of course, this presentation on the wondrous architecture of Art Deco cinemas, prepared for us by the exhibition curator and walking tour guide, Professor Bruce Peter. Bruce Peter is Professor of Design History at the Glasgow School of Art. He first investigated cinema architecture in the early 1990s, publishing Glasgow's Amazing Cinemas in 1996, which was the centenary year of film exhibition in Scotland. His newest publication is Art Deco Scotland, published by Historic Environment Scotland, and recently announced as the winner of the Saltire Award for Best Research Book of 2025. Now, I had the great pleasure of meeting Bruce last summer, and he has been a fantastically generous and supportive collaborator. I'm very much looking forward to learning from him about the stories behind the design of the many Art Deco cinemas that have been, and in some cases, continue to be such beloved features of our townscapes across Scotland. Now, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm just going to share my screen. I first became interested in cinema buildings when I became a student at Glasgow School of Art in the early 1990s. And they, of course, feature as one of the chapters in the Art Deco Scotland book. But I want to go back to those days when I was in my late teens, and I had a student colleague in environmental art, and she was very interested in the subject too. So we decided to join all the bingo clubs in Glasgow, which belonged to 3 chains. One was Mecca, part of the Rank organisation, who also had Odeon Cinemas at that time, another lot called County Bingo, and a third lot called Vogue Bingo. Vogue Bingo was the continuation of the cinema chain that had been developed by George Singleton, a major Glasgow entertainment tycoon in the 1920s and 30s. And unlike the others, the Vogue company was still run by a Singleton, Ronald Singleton, a very delightful gentleman, and he was extremely welcoming. So we were able to go around his different premises. The other bingo halls we had to join and go in incognito. The first thing that astonished me, because I had no clue what bingo was that it was simply crossing off numbers on little pieces of paper that were randomly generated, kind of clerical work with prizes. But these buildings, other than having seats around tables put in where the stalls used to be, were otherwise extremely intact. And in the bottom left picture, you can see part of the balcony of the Vogue cinema as had been latterly a bingo hall in Langlands Road in Govan, which still had its original 1930s Art Deco carpets, albeit somewhat besmirched by decades of cigarette ash and butts being rubbed into them. The image bottom right, it was one of my absolute favourites, which was the Orient in the Gallowgate in Glasgow's East End, a Mecca bingo club latterly, with an extraordinary atmospheric interior. The result of these investigations was the publication of Glasgow's Amazing Cinemas by Polygon in 1996, and that came out in the year when I graduated from the art school. The image top right shows me as I appeared then on my matriculation card. And after that time, I didn't think terribly much more about cinemas, but I'm very, very glad that I got the pictures I did back then. Of course, bingo halls were gaming establishments, and you weren't really supposed to take photographs when sessions were in progress. In those days, you didn't have phones where you could take silent incognito pictures. I had a SLR camera with quite a noisy shutter. So it was necessary to be quite careful. And of course, that wasn't easy either, because as a bunch of art students, we stuck out like sore thumbs. But I did my best, and the images provide a record of buildings that have, for the most part, disappeared. One of the few survivors, though in a precarious condition, is the former Lyceum in Govan, which you see in these images, and you can also see that its interiors contained a splendid Art Deco terrazzo, 1930s light fittings, and numerous other interesting surviving parts. Before we look at Art Deco cinemas, of which these were examples, we need to think about the background of film and cinema architecture, because what was built in the 30s was really a continuation of a very particular trajectory. Back in the latter 19th century, the cinema was considered to be a scientific novelty. Essentially, the idea of finding a mechanism by which motion of people and animals and vehicles could be captured was it was waiting to be happen. This was something that was many different groups of inventors and mechanics were trying to discover how to do. And of course, it also involved chemistry. So kind of a synthesis of small-scale mechanicking to create a camera to make films. And on the other hand, you had to make the celluloid on which they were recorded. So these kind of motion studies were a precursor to the invention of cinema, and they were presented very much within the context of the sciences and of technology. Cinema, as it developed later on, however, evolved into something completely different, which hadn't been imagined by these initial would-be inventors of the medium. And it became part of the new early 20th century phenomenon of mass culture. And already in the 19th century, mass culture in its existing forms was thought to be problematic. And when the cinema came along, it became the archetypal form of mass culture, especially once talkies were introduced. And of course, cinema architecture, housing the medium, was associated very much with the problematics of mass culture. The idea that it was escapist, that it was unreal, that it was mass-produced somewhere else, mostly Hollywood by the 1930s, and consumed remotely by people who were, in terms of their local culture, very, very different. So a lot of theorizing and writing on mass culture from the 1930s, when Art Deco cinemas were built, is highly negative. And it was seen to be a kind of opiate for the masses, acting on people, especially the working classes, who were deemed to be all too easily led, in a similar way to religion, creating a false reality that people would become seduced by, and kind of it would fill their minds. And perhaps if you were a Marxist, you'd worry that it would blind them to the poverty of their lot. If you were a conservative, you'd worry that they were fantasizing about American film stars like Jane Mansfield and neglecting the vernacular culture, whatever that might have amounted to at that time. The first film show, however, following the scientific trajectory, was presented in the Regent Street Polytechnic Hall. So that was a kind of technology and science institution, and it was presented by the Lumiere brothers, who were French inventors. As I said, they were only one of several lots of different inventors on both sides of the Atlantic who were attempting to perfect technologies that would enable film to be made and shown. But very, very quickly, operators of variety theatres realized that showing very short reels of film in the interval between live acts was a smart addition to keep audiences engaged. And so in Scotland, the first film show happened in the spring of 1896 in the Empire Palace Theatre in Edinburgh, which is now the Edinburgh Festival Theatre. It's been very heavily rebuilt after a fire in the interim. But it's sort of interesting that the speed at which the move from the world of science to the world of entertainment happened. In Glasgow, the first film show was given in a building just below the School of Art in Sauchiehall Street, a building that very sadly has only recently been partially demolished. It was originally the ice skating palace, built for that craze in the latter 19th century, and that was the mode it was in when the first film show happened a little bit later in the spring of 1896. It later on became the Glasgow home of Hengler Circus. Later still, in the end of the 1920s, it became ABC's Regal Cinema, and it remained a cinema until the latter 1990s, and then became a live music venue, sadly destroyed in the same fire as ruined the Macintosh building in 2018. Fairground showmen also realized that adding cinema shows to their fairgrounds would be a useful way of making extra money and keeping up to date. This is the Green family's Vinegar Hill showground in the east end of Glasgow in the 1900s, part of its exterior and part of the scene inside with great crowds. And the building in the background of the bottom image is Green's White Veil Theatre, which was one of the first permanent cinema buildings in Glasgow. The Greens, of course, later became very successful cinema operators, initially in the provinces around Glasgow and the west of Scotland. They toured travelling cinema shows, and you can see their initial show booth top left. You can see a slightly more advanced and improved version bottom left, which is beginning to become architectonic. It's beginning to take on the qualities of the facade of a cinema building, even though it's only a collapsible tent. And then on the right, we've got Green's Picturedrome in the Gorbals, which is a permanent cinema in a densely populated working class district of Glasgow. And you can see that there's a kind of continuum in terms of design between the little Italianate towers that have been added in plywood to each side of the facade of the show booth, and the design of the frontage of that early purpose-built cinema. So there's this lineage from fairground into the cinema, as well as there is from variety theatre. The Hippodrome in Bo'ness is a particularly interesting early cinema, and architecturally an extremely fine and very original example by the brilliant local architect Matthew Steele, whose work we'll be looking at in a lot of detail on the Art Deco walking tour. In 1909, an Act of Parliament called the Kinematograph Act was passed, and that legislated for cinemas to be of entirely fireproof construction with separate projection booths because nitrate film stock was highly flammable. There should be enough fire exits for the whole audience and some rudimentary firefighting equipment. And that legislation moved the cinema from being potentially a temporary novelty, like all the others, ice skating, roller skating, all sorts of trends had come and gone in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, into something that seemed to suggest a degree of permanence. So the Hippodrome Bowness is one of the early cinemas built after the passing of the Act, and at a time when architects were trying to work out how a cinema should be designed. We've seen that Green's Picturedrome in the Gorbals was essentially a development of the fairground show booth with a fancy facade on a quite plain rear quarters. The Hippodrome Bowness is a much more integrated building with a circular auditorium, which was typical of circuses, but rather unusual for cinemas. It's like a miniature version of Hengler's Circus in type form, but it never was a cinema. This was Matthew Steele attempting to work out how a cinema might be designed. And of course, looking at the image of the building when it was new, bottom left, you can see that it's got some resonances in its design with the concurrent work of the likes of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, James Salmon Jr., and other architects associated with the Scottish version of Art Nouveau. During the First World War, Europe bankrupted itself and managed to slaughter millions. And meanwhile, America continued to advance developments in cinema technology and in cinema architecture. And by the 1920s, American cinema companies, both filmmakers and film exhibitors, had developed major leads over the Europeans and the British. In the 1920s in America, a cheaper solution to the design of interiors than the theatrical style that had been preferred hitherto was to create what were called atmospheric venues, where the ceiling was treated as a kind of smooth plaster sky. And around the side walls, buildings in low relief were arranged in order to suggest a kind of romantic courtyard. And that design approach echoed the style of a number of the film sets of the era. You sort of think about films that were supposed to be set in the Middle East and in places that were considered far-flung and exotic. The image at the top shows a section through the Boulevard Cinema in Glasgow's Knightswood district. There's an image of it at the bottom left. The image bottom right shows the Orient in the Gallowgate, which I showed earlier on as a bingo hall. Atmospheric cinemas were briefly popular also in Britain between the late 1920s and the early 1930s, but they had a problem once the talkies came along, once films with sound began to appear from the late 20s onwards, and that is that their acoustics sometimes were not ideal for sound reproduction. Before we go any further with regard to aesthetics, however, it's necessary to consider the development of hidden technology. Cinemas had romantic interiors of one style or another, whether looking like traditional European opera houses or the atmospheric style that we've just seen, or, as we're going to see shortly, ones that were, in one sense or another, generally modern or Art Deco. And these interiors were completely separate from the shells. Between, of course, there were typically steel frames, but there was a void space, and that void space contained quite complex hidden servicing, heating and ventilation systems, and one of the, of course, popular advertising tricks for cinemas in hot places like the southern states of the USA was that you would be cool and air conditioned and comfortable inside the cinema, if not outside. In Britain, where people were strangely allowed to smoke in the cinema in those days, one of the advantages of the forced ventilation was they could claim that the cinemas would be constantly refreshed in terms of their air and the smoke would be extracted. But it kind of meant that the interiors of cinemas could never achieve the relationship with the exteriors that was typically required of theorists of modern architecture of the Corbusier or Gropius variety. Cinemas were and remained decorated sheds, by and large. They had fancy frontages. They had rather plain rear quarters. In Scotland, many were simply tents of asbestos cement panels, and they had fancy interiors. It all made commercial sense because the money was spent where it would have the maximum impact. But as far as architecture critics of the era was concerned, whether they were traditionalists or progressives, cinemas were bad architecture. And the reason why they were bad was because they didn't amount to any kind of totality in which all the elements hung together. The one place where things were slightly better from that point of view was Germany, where in the late 1920s, a school of commercial modern architecture that's sometimes known as expressionism came to the fore, particularly in Berlin. And a British architecture critic called P. Morton Shand, actually he was the grandfather of Queen Camilla, wrote a book called Modern Theatres and Cinemas that was filled with German examples. And so they came to be slightly and then increasingly influential in Britain in the 30s. Here we see the Universum and Titania Palast cinemas in Berlin. Both of these buildings remarkably still survive, notwithstanding the heavy bombing of the war. Bottom left, we have not a cinema, but a theatre called the Großes Schauspielhaus, designed by Hans Polzig for Max Reinhardt, the famous Berlin impresario. And that building then influenced a British architect, a young British architect called Ernest Walmsley Lewis, who got the job of designing a new cinema at Victoria in London called the New Victoria for part of the Gaumont British cinema chain. And he decided to emulate, or at least to take inspiration, from the Großes Schauspielhaus in the design of the interior and from other Berlin cinemas in the design of the building envelope. At the opening of that cinema in 1930, one of the guests was another young architect who was an acquaintance of his called Alistair G. MacDonald, and he was the son of the Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. And he was very impressed by the New Victoria and also by the design of German and Berlin cinemas more generally. And he then got the task of designing a number of small, what were called newsreel theatres, small cinemas to show newsreels and cartoons that were located on the concourses of Victoria and Waterloo stations. So these were kind of indoor buildings built of asbestos, and they had very dynamic and futuristic designs. But a little bit around the same time, back in Scotland, MacDonald was asked by Caledonian Associated Cinemas, which was the large provincial chain covering the Highlands and the provincial areas of Scotland, to design a couple of cinemas for it. Two of the first were the Murray Playhouse in Elgin, and then there was the Angus Playhouse in Montrose of 1932 to 33. Now, Caledonian Associated Cinemas didn't have terribly much money. And so the fact that these cinemas were of a modern design is partly because that was MacDonald's taste, but I think that he was hired by Caledonian because he could do a job cheaply. And he did an excellent one. The Murray Playhouse in Elgin is very obviously influenced by the New Victoria, with these kind of shell shapes on the side walls. And the cinema in Montrose, well, its exterior clearly shows a great deal of influence from German Expressionism, perhaps via Shand's book. So Scotland got two of the first Art Deco cinemas in Britain outside London through the Alistair MacDonald link. And rather than being in the big cities, they're way out in the north. So kind of unusual. Caledonian cinemas advanced quickly in the 1930s, and a little bit later, they next commissioned a different architect, a Highland architect called Alec Catanack, who was the son of an established architect in Kinusay, to design a flagship property for them, the Playhouse in Perth, which he produced working jointly with an Edinburgh architect who had existing knowledge of cinema design called Thomas Bohill Gibson. The Playhouse in Perth is still existing and operating. The image on the left shows how it looks today. And it too, in its facade composition with these vertical ribs above the entrance and the horizontal panels with curving returns on either side, is also very obviously influenced by the facade composition of the New Victoria. In Aberdeen, meanwhile, a local cinema chain, Aberdeen Picture Palaces, commissioned another architect who had a big firm in Aberdeen, A. Marshall Mackenzie, to design for them a new flagship cinema on the city's Union Street. Now, Mackenzie had offices in Aberdeen and also London. And it so happened that at Mackenzie's London office, a new employee called David Stokes had just arrived when this project appeared in Aberdeen. And as the London office didn't have enough work, he was a new graduate from the Architectural Association. He'd never been to Scotland in his life. He was sent on a train straight to Aberdeen and told to begin work. So the capital in Aberdeen is entirely his project. And magnificent it was too. In the 1990s, it was still very, very intact, down to small details like the confectionery stall in the foyer and the upholstery in the auditorium, the lighting scheme. It even had a working cinema organ. By then, it was mostly being used as a live music venue, and it's very sad that having remained intact for so long, a little bit later, permission was given to gut the whole thing to rebuild it as two nightclubs, which of course had a very short existence, and the building was then demolished, apart from the facade and foyer, enabling the construction of two office blocks. So the capital in Aberdeen was a superb example of its type. It was again very early for Britain, 1933, to have this kind of Germanic influenced modern cinema architecture. And what a shame it no longer exists, other than as a facade retention. In Glasgow, the American Paramount chain built one of their provincial cinemas. They, having built various buildings in London's West End and in its inner suburbs, they then decided to build cinemas in Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Birmingham, and elsewhere. And the Paramount in Glasgow, completed in 1954, was the work of their London architects Verity and Beverley, who designed most of their other cinemas and were primarily specialists in the design of theatres. The Glasgow Paramount was a magnificent place, very, very opulently decorated and with all the trimmings. It had a restaurant and cafe. It had a cinema organ, and really, really a spectacular piece of design that looked especially fine at night, as you can see in the top left image, showing the neon outlining and floodlighting. It later became an Odeon when the war came, and then a multiplex cinema from the 1970s to the early 2000s. Nowadays, only its frontage survives in the city as converted into an office block. In the suburbs, big super cinemas were built all over Britain in the 1930s, and Glasgow in particular had some fine examples. This is the Granada Parkhead, designed by the firm of Lennox and McMath and completed in 1935, with an interior by Guthrie and Wells. Such was the speed of the building of cinemas by the mid-30s that it became quite the thing for the architects only to design the shell of the building and for a separate company of decorators to outfit it inside. And Guthrie and Wells were a very famous and excellent Glasgow decorators who switched from one fashionable style to another. They were really kept up to date. And in the early to mid-30s, they embraced the popular subcategory of Art Deco that's known as jazz moderne, which attempted to take the ideas of jazz music, of syncopated rhythms and shout riffs, and convert them into a visual language. And you see this style also, for example, in the ceramics work of Clarice Cliff, which is very famous. This cinema was almost like a Clarice Cliff ceramic set made into a complete interior. Very bright colours, and this was it as a bingo hall, extremely well preserved, but all done in the cheapest of materials. This is just done with layered plasterboard and emulsion paint, but with a tremendous visual effect. And I think the waves around the proscenium and the skyscrapers on the display walls for the ventilation grills are particularly effective. Lennox and McMath designed quite a lot of cinemas around Glasgow and west central Scotland. Even more prolific was the firm of John McKissick and Son, the lead architect of which was James McKissick, who designed many cinemas around Glasgow, in Ayrshire, even over in Fife and in suburbs in Edinburgh. This is his Commodore in Scotstoun from 1933. McKissick really liked multicolored, polychromatic, faience-tiled frontages. But the interiors of his designs tended to be very plain, and that was often because the operators, in this case the Singleton Company, didn't like to spend money on decor because they typically began the show with the house lights off before they let the audience in, because that saved money. Back in those days, people didn't mind seeing a film that had already begun, and you'd see the middle and the end of it, and then you'd watch the first part. Somehow, nowadays, we're used to seeing films in the order that directors intended, but it's not typical of the way things were in the past. A later design by McKissick is the Aldwych at Cardonald, and that's a much larger and more austere-looking building, still with faience tiling around the entrance area. This one was very short-lived, however. It was in an outer suburb, and it was closed already in the early 60s and demolished for a supermarket, a question of one fashionable building type being replaced by another. The most famous of McKissick's designs and of the members of the Singleton Circuit, however, is the Cosmo in Glasgow, now the Glasgow Film Theatre. This is in the city centre, and in the centre, it was typical of all cities, it was typical that the first-run films from the big studios went to cinemas belonging to the Tide circuit. You've already seen the Paramount in Glasgow. Well, Odeon and Gaumont and ABC all had studios in Hollywood whose films they showed. So for an independent operator like Singleton, it was very difficult or impossible to get new American films which the mass audience wanted to see. So instead, with a number of former university friends, he decided to make a cinema to show foreign films, which had been somewhat edged out since the advent of talkies, but Glasgow had a major university, a big technical college, an art school, a music conservatoire, and so there was a big intelligentsia audience who'd want to see French and other types of foreign film. And the Cosmo was from the outset a very big success, and since the mid-1970s it's continued to be a success as the GFT. Its design takes inspiration from the Dutch architect Willem Marinus Dudok, who typically used brown Dutch bricks, and he was very influential in Britain, particularly for public buildings in the 1930s. His architecture was considered upmarket of the mainstream of Art Deco, so much so that he won, or was awarded, the RIBA's gold medal in 1935. In central Scotland, many big cinemas were built in the 30s. Here are two of ABC's in places that are proximal to Bowness, the Regal in Falkirk and the Regal in Stirling, which were both designed by the Glasgow firm of Charles J. McNair and Elder. And their work was, I think, the best of Scottish cinema architecture in the Art Deco style in the 30s. These buildings are in their earlier, more rectilinear phase. They've got a bit of jazz moderne about them. But by the latter 30s, McNair and his assistant Robert Elder were really getting into their stride. And they started producing buildings that were much more Germanic influenced in this kind of streamlined idiom. The Lyceum in Govan is a fabulous example and thankfully still standing, although in a precarious condition. Interestingly, its frontage has a void behind. The cinema auditorium is in the back court of the tenement, some way to the rear, and the entrance hall was only a story and a half. So instead of leaving an ugly void, Elder, who was the main designer in McNair's office, created this wall with glass blocks above the doors to create a kind of false impression of a dramatic, striking, streamlined frontage. And it works extremely well. Here's a couple of images of the interiors of the Lyceum in Govan, its entrance hall, and a view across the auditorium. We saw it near the beginning when it was a bingo hall. Another fine McNair design from the late 1930s was the Ascot in Anniesland. This building only survives as a facade. It was completed in the autumn of 1939, by which time the Second World War had begun. And the war brought cinema construction to an abrupt halt. In Edinburgh, Bohill Gibson, who we've already met for the Perth Playhouse, designed also some very fine examples. One was the County in Portobello, later the George, which still stands in a derelict condition with an uncertain future. And on the right, we see the very alive and well Dominion in Morningside, still operated by the family of the original owner. Andrew Haxton of Leven is another cinema architect worth considering. This is his beautiful Regal in Bathgate, which not so many years ago was very nicely restored as a community theatre. It's a charming building, and like so many of the others, originally it would have had neon lighting, but in this instance, it's been very well restored. And this sort of image of it, taken at twilight, I think really gives the impression of why people found cinema buildings so exciting in the 1930s. They really were dramatic additions to small provincial towns, and they spread everywhere. Some even more extraordinary examples. These are by James Houston, an architect from Kilbirnie, who was Glasgow School of Art trained. The radio in Kilbirnie, taking the theme of radio, and the Viking in Largs, designed a bit like a castle to commemorate the Battle of Largs. Being half Danish, I should be proud. And even smaller examples in smaller towns sometimes were built without the involvement of architects at all. Here we've got the Cinema Deluxe in Denny and the Regal in Dalry, both of which were simply constructed by builders' companies who had imbibed what an Art Deco cinema would look like and created their own versions for budgets that their clients could afford, and often built very efficiently and effectively. Outside of Scotland, William Glenn became ABC's house architect in London. He was a Glaswegian trained at Glasgow School of Art. He designed some cinemas in Glasgow, but in the early 30s, he was brought south to work in ABC's headquarters in Soho in London, where he produced designs for simply dozens and dozens of cinemas, from Torquay in the south to Middlesbrough in the north. They were all over the country. He only produced two designs in Scotland, the Regal in Edinburgh and the Palace in Arbroath in the late 1930s. Both have been lost, but typically of Glenn, they had magnificent-looking, streamlined auditoria. One of his best designs externally, I think, is the Westover in Bournemouth. So Scottish cinema architects got everywhere. And architects from the south also made proposals to design cinemas in Scotland. Odeon bought up part of the Singleton circuit in the mid-1930s, and they then decided to build cinemas on their own account, using the London firm of Andrew Mather to design these. And one of Mather's assistants, Keith P. Roberts, did a set of subsequent designs for very large Odeons, one of which would have been in Falkirk, but these never got built because of the war. This is the unbuilt design for the Odeon in Partick, which would also have been a very impressive building. I want to talk next very briefly about Art Deco. I've mentioned the term many, many times. Art Deco takes its name from the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes of 1925, a great exhibition of the decorative arts, which was highly eclectic, as you can see from these pictures. When we think of Art Deco as a style, however, we typically think of the sort of thing that you can see in the bottom left image, which is the pavilion of the Galerie Lafayette department store. And it doesn't take terribly much imagination to think of the volumes on each side of the entrance, well, one maybe having a hairdresser's and the other having a Birrell newsagent's or sweetie shop, it having a cinema name sign, ABC Regal in big letters at the top of the frontage, there being a canopy with a film advert on it above the doors, and you've got pretty much the formula for the facade of a super cinema. So that kind of design really struck a chord with commercial architects and their clients in the period after the Paris exhibition. And Art Deco spread all over the world. In Scotland, many of the cinemas, of course, took a degree of influence from concurrent work in Germany rather than France. But that doesn't matter, because the term Art Deco was hardly, if ever, used in the 1930s. Typically, commercial modern architecture was just called modern. And it wasn't until the mid-1960s that the term Art Deco started to be used. And the first event that I can find where this happened was an exhibition in the Louvre in 1966 called Les années 25 Art Deco Bauhaus Style l'Esprit Nouveau. And that was looking at a whole gamut of European modern architecture, the stuff associated with the Paris exhibition, the Bauhaus. The style was in the Netherlands. L'Esprit Nouveau was the grouping associated with Le Corbusier, so modernism with a capital M. That exhibition then influenced a young British historian called Bevis Hillier, who you see on the right there, a very, very good and clever writer, who wrote a book called Art Deco. And that really defined the style as we understand it today, as a kind of umbrella term that's a catch-all for all sorts of modern commercial and decorative work that can't be considered as modernism or the modern movement, of the sort that was defined by the likes of Corbusier, Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and others. So Art Deco, when we think of it now, it's a term that's applied retrospectively, and we know it when we see it. You put up slides of Art Deco cinemas in a PowerPoint, and everybody, that's Art Deco, that's Art Deco, that's Art. Even although the buildings come from different points of architectural origin. So they're sort of examples of the whole gamut of things that are caught under Art Deco. The kind of rectilinear style of buildings like the Regal in Bathgate and the Regals in Stirling and Falkirk and others we've seen, Capitol in Aberdeen, the work of Alistair MacDonald in Montrose, thematic buildings like the Viking in Largs and the Radio in Kilbirnie, buildings that are jazzy like the Granada at Parkhead and various others, buildings that are streamlined and more in the manner of German expressionism like the Lyceum in Govan. All of these, to us, are Art Deco. That's pretty much all I want to say. I'm very grateful to you for listening, and I hope you found the presentation of value. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was absolutely wonderful. Just wonderfully illustrated and so rich in detail. I really love the image of you and your fellow students going undercover in the bingo to do your research in the 80s. Um, and it was lovely, especially, of course, to see the early pictures of the Hippodrome really showing that circular auditorium that actually isn't that obvious from the outside today. And great to hear you speak about in the context of the architectural significance and the achievement of Matthew Steele in his design of the Hippodrome. We're so lucky that our cinema has survived and it escaped the fate of so many of the cinemas that you've talked about, despite not being in a big city like the GFT is. Those cinemas like the Regal Cinema in Glasgow, Sauchiehall Street, and the Glasgow and Paramount that people, I'm sure, watching will have so many fond memories of. And another thing I wanted to say, I really loved seeing the colours on the insides of the buildings. We've got some beautiful colour scheme inside the Hippodrome, and I know that was meticulously researched and restored when the building was reopened. But yeah, I really loved the pictures of the interior of the Granada Parkwood, I think it was, the jazz modern style that you talked about, and the sort of echoing of Clarice Cliff's ceramics work. Really, really interesting. And just a little word to say, you mentioned the George in Portobello, and just want to do a shout out of good luck to the folk in Portobello who are fighting to save the George so it can continue to be a cinema for future generations. Thank you as well to all of you at home for tuning in and joining us. Just to remind you, this conversation will remain on the Falkirk Leisure and Culture YouTube channel in our Hitfest at Home playlist, where you can rewatch at your leisure. And I hope you'll join us again soon for our next Hitfest at Home presentation. We've got one more scheduled before the festival kickoff on the theme of Weimar slapstick. And that's presented by Dr. Paul Flake. And that presentation is going to be released on Tuesday, the 10th of March. And it ties in with our screening of Saxophone Susie on Saturday, the 21st of March, featuring live music by a suitably jazz-inflected trio of musicians Jane Gardner, Hazel Morrison, and John Burgess. And you will be able to watch an as-live screening of Saxophone Susie online, thanks to our Hitfest at Home offer, with the worldwide viewing window open from the 30th of March to the 6th of April. A quick reminder too that our excellent value Hitfest passes are on sale now, with 5-day and weekend passes available, as well as a weekend pass for under 30s and a digital pass for all 7 films in the streaming lineup. Great bargains to be had there. And on a final note, we think it's important that these wonderful presentations about the joys of early cinema are available all year round, free of charge, and we're committed to growing our library of multimedia resources via our Hitfest at Home playlist. And we hope you enjoy browsing the other titles available and learning more about silent film from a host of knowledgeable and engaging speakers like the one we've just had today. If you felt able to donate to Hitfest to support our online and in-person screenings programming, there is a link for donations in the episode info. And just note that there are 4 Falkirk Council venues seeking donations, and each option autofills at £1. And Hitfest is the second box in the list, and please amend the amounts however you want to. Thank you so much, and see you soon.